The naval architect stares at the blueprints at 1400 hours on June 5, 1942. Hermann Berkner stands in the offices of Deschimag shipyard in Bremen, examining conversion plans for the heavy cruiser Seydlitz, a ship 95% complete and scheduled for commissioning in 3 months. The plans call for removing the superstructure, extending a flight deck over the hull, and converting the cruiser into an aircraft carrier. The conversion is technically possible but logistically insane. Seydlitz has been under construction for 5 years. Her machinery is installed. Her armor is in place. Her hull is complete. Converting her to a carrier means undoing years of work, scrapping completed systems, and building entirely new structures on a platform never designed for them. The project will consume resources Germany cannot spare, require expertise Germany does not have, and produce a carrier that will be obsolete before completion and inadequate even if finished. But Adolf Hitler has ordered it. Admiral Erich Raeder has endorsed it, and the Kriegsmarine desperately wants aircraft carriers after watching British carriers attack German positions in Norway, and Italian carriers fail to materialize as promised. In 3 years, Seydlitz will still be incomplete, her conversion abandoned, her hull scuttled to prevent capture by advancing Soviet forces. She will become the symbol of Germany's strategic confusion about naval aviation, the ship that almost became a carrier, but instead became monument to wasted resources, misplaced priorities, and the fundamental impossibility of building complex weapon systems through improvisation when industrial capacity is already strained and strategic circumstances are deteriorating. KMS Seydlitz was an Admiral Hipper-class heavy cruiser, designed for commerce raiding and fleet operations. The Admiral Hipper-class specifications reflected German naval strategy in the late 1930s. Displacement: 14,000 tons standard, 18,200 tons full load. Length: 212 meters. Beam: 21.3 meters. Draft: 7.2 meters. Armament: 8 20-centimeter guns and 4 twin turrets, 12 10.5-centimeter anti-aircraft guns, 12 3.7-centimeter anti-aircraft guns, 12 torpedo tubes. Armor: 80mm belt, 105mm turret faces. Maximum speed: 32 knots. Range: 6,800 nautical miles at 20 knots. Crew: 1,600. The ships were designed to raid Allied commerce, outfight cruisers, and outrun battleships. They were larger and more powerful than treaty cruisers, violating the Washington Naval Treaty limits Germany had nominally accepted. But by the late 1930s, treaty constraints were collapsing and Germany prioritized capability over compliance. Seydlitz was laid down at Deschimag shipyard in Bremen in December 1936, launched in January 1939, and was scheduled for completion in autumn 1942. But construction was delayed repeatedly. Steel shortages diverted material to U-boat construction. Labor shortages pulled workers to higher priority projects. The war that began in September 1939 disrupted civilian shipbuilding completely. By mid-1942, Seydlitz was 95% complete, but the final 5% was delayed indefinitely. The German Navy had recognized the importance of aircraft carriers during planning for war against Britain. Pre-war plans called for building 4 carriers to support surface raiders and provide air cover for fleet operations. The first carrier, Graf Zeppelin, was laid down in December 1936, launched in December 1938, and was intended for completion in 1940. Graf Zeppelin's design called for displacement of 33,000 tons, flight deck length of 250 meters, and air group of 42 aircraft. She would be the Kriegsmarine's flagship, the symbol of German naval aviation, the answer to British carrier dominance. But construction problems plagued the project from the beginning. The Kriegsmarine had no experience building carriers. The Luftwaffe, which controlled all German military aviation, refused to cooperate in developing carrier aircraft or training pilots. Resources were diverted to more urgent projects. By September 1939, Graf Zeppelin was approximately 85% complete, but work had essentially stopped. The second carrier, the unnamed Flugzeugträger B, was laid down in September 1938 and suspended in April 1940 at approximately 13% complete. The third and fourth carriers were never laid down. Germany's carrier program had collapsed before producing a single operational ship, but the need for carriers became apparent through operational experience. In April 1940, German forces invaded Norway. British carrier aircraft attacked German positions, sank German ships, and demonstrated carrier capability in confined waters. The Kriegsmarine had no effective response. Surface ships without air cover were vulnerable. The lack of carriers limited German naval options. In 1941, the Kriegsmarine attempted to solve the carrier shortage through alliance. Italy, Germany's Axis partner, had 2 carriers under construction. The Aquila and Sparviero were converted liners that would provide limited carrier capability. Germany hoped to borrow or lease these ships once completed. But Italian carrier construction was even more troubled than Germany's. Neither ship would be completed before Italy's surrender in September 1943. By mid-1942, the strategic situation was deteriorating. The Soviet Union had not collapsed as expected. The war in the East was consuming resources at unsustainable rates. The Mediterranean campaign required forces Germany could not spare, and the Atlantic convoy battles were being lost as Allied escorts improved and air cover expanded. Hitler and Raeder, facing these strategic problems, fixated on carriers as potential solution. Carriers could protect surface raiders in the Atlantic. Carriers could support operations in Norway. Carriers could project power in ways surface ships could not. The fact that Germany lacked experience building carriers, training carrier pilots, or operating carrier groups did not deter them. The need seemed urgent. The solution seemed obvious: build carriers immediately. But Germany had no carrier hulls available. Graf Zeppelin might be completed, but her construction had been suspended for 2 years, and resuming work would require extensive effort. New carrier construction would take years Germany did not have. The solution was conversion. Take existing hulls and convert them to carriers. The logic was superficially compelling. Several ships were available. The passenger liners Europa and Potsdam were in German hands. The incomplete cruisers Seydlitz and Lützow were in shipyards. Converting these ships to carriers would be faster than building new hulls from scratch. The conversions could be completed in months rather than years. Germany would have carriers operational by 1943. The logic collapsed when confronted with reality. Converting passenger liners to carriers required extensive structural modifications. The liners had multiple decks, civilian layouts, machinery designed for different purposes. Conversion would be nearly as complex as building new ships. Converting cruisers was even worse. Cruiser hulls were narrow. Their machinery was configured for cruiser operations. Their armor schemes were incompatible with carrier requirements. Conversion would require removing most of what made them cruisers and building carrier systems on hulls never intended for such use. But Hitler ordered conversions to proceed. On June 5, 1942, Seydlitz was designated for conversion to aircraft carrier. The conversion plan called for removing the superstructure, turrets, and upper deck structures. The hull from the waterline up would be gutted. A flight deck 175 meters long would be built over the hull. A hangar would be constructed below the flight deck. Aircraft elevators, arresting gear, and catapults would be installed. The air group would consist of 18 fighters and 12 dive bombers. The project was assigned to Deschimag shipyard, the same yard that had built Seydlitz. Work began in July 1942. The existing superstructure was removed. The turrets were lifted out. The upper decks were cut away. The ship that had been 95% complete as a cruiser was reduced to bare hull with machinery. Then the problems began. The flight deck required structural support that the cruiser hull could not provide without extensive modification. The hangar needed to be built into the hull, requiring removal of compartments and reconfiguration of internal spaces. The machinery, designed for cruiser operations, needed modification to provide power and systems for carrier operations. Every aspect of the conversion revealed new complications. The engineering challenges were substantial but solvable given time and resources. Germany had neither. The shipyard lacked experience with carrier construction. The Luftwaffe refused to provide expertise on aircraft requirements. The procurement system could not deliver specialized equipment needed for carrier operations. Arresting gear had to be designed from scratch. Elevators required custom engineering. Catapults were beyond Germany's technical capability, so the carrier would rely on aircraft taking off under their own power, limiting aircraft types that could be operated. The aircraft themselves were problematic. The Luftwaffe had no carrier-capable fighters or dive bombers. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Junkers Ju-87 would need modification for carrier operations. Strengthened landing gear, arrestor hooks, folding wings, These modifications would reduce performance and require extensive testing. The Luftwaffe had no interest in conducting such modifications for aircraft. It did not want to operate from carriers it did not control. The institutional conflict between Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe was a fundamental obstacle. The Luftwaffe, under Hermann Göring, controlled all German military aviation. Göring refused to allow the Kriegsmarine independent air component. Carrier aircraft would be Luftwaffe property, operated by Luftwaffe pilots under Luftwaffe command. But the Luftwaffe had no tradition of naval aviation, no training for carrier operations, and no interest in diverting resources from land-based aviation to support naval operations. This meant that even if Seydlitz was completed as carrier, she would have no trained pilots, no doctrine for carrier operations, and no institutional support from the organization that controlled her aircraft. The conversion was producing platform without the capability to make the platform useful. By late 1942, the conversion was months behind schedule and consuming resources needed elsewhere. Steel allocated to Seydlitz could have built U-boats. Labor working on the conversion could have repaired damaged ships. The project was justified by urgency, but the urgency was undermined by the pace of work. In February 1943, Hitler ordered work on Seydlitz suspended. The official reason was resource priorities. U-boat construction was critical to the Atlantic campaign. Cruiser and destroyer construction supported surface fleet operations. Carrier conversion was an experimental project with uncertain payoff. Resources would be better allocated elsewhere. The real reason was recognition that the conversion was failing. The technical problems were insurmountable without expertise Germany lacked. The institutional problems between Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe were unresolvable, and the strategic situation had deteriorated to a point where carriers, even if completed, would have limited utility. Germany was losing the war. Expensive experimental projects could not change that reality. Work stopped in February 1943 with Seydlitz approximately 30% converted. The flight deck structure was partially built. The hangar was incomplete. The machinery was installed but not integrated with carrier systems. The ship was neither cruiser nor carrier but hybrid wreck. She sat in Bremen through 1943 and 1944, incomplete and useless. Plans were proposed to complete her as cruiser, reverting the conversion and finishing the ship in her original configuration. But this would have required removing all the carrier modifications and rebuilding the superstructure and armament. The work would take as long as original construction and consume resources Germany could not spare. Alternative plans proposed completing her as carrier despite earlier suspension. But these plans faced the same problems that had caused suspension: lack of expertise, institutional conflicts, resource shortages. The proposals were studied and rejected repeatedly. By early 1945, Soviet forces were approaching Bremen. The shipyard was within range of Soviet artillery. Seydlitz, still incomplete and immobile, could not be moved. On April 10, 1945, she was scuttled in shallow water to prevent capture. She sank at her berth, settling onto the bottom, her incomplete hull becoming obstacle to navigation. Post-war, the wreck was raised by Soviet forces in 1946. The Soviets examined the ship, considered completing her, and decided the project was not worthwhile. The hull was too damaged. The conversion was too incomplete, and the Soviets had captured more useful ships elsewhere. Seydlitz was scrapped in 1947. Her entire existence was waste. 9 years of construction and conversion produced nothing operational. Resources consumed could have built dozens of U-boats or completed Graf Zeppelin if concentrated effort had been applied. Labor diverted to Seydlitz might have accelerated other projects. The ship that almost became a carrier instead became symbol of strategic confusion and wasted effort. The comparison to Graf Zeppelin is instructive. Graf Zeppelin was purpose-built carrier, designed from the keel up for carrier operations. Her construction faced numerous problems, but the problems were solvable because the design was coherent. Seydlitz was cruiser being forcibly converted into carrier. Her problems were fundamental. The hull was wrong shape. The machinery was wrong configuration. The systems were incompatible with carrier operations. Solving these problems required essentially rebuilding the ship, which defeated the purpose of conversion. The broader context was Germany's fundamental misunderstanding of carrier operations. Carriers were not magic solutions to strategic problems. They were complex systems requiring trained pilots, specialized aircraft, experienced deck crews, and doctrine developed through years of practice. Britain had been operating carriers since 1920s. The United States had been developing carrier doctrine since early 1930s. Japan had integrated carriers into fleet operations throughout the interwar period. Germany had none of this. The Kriegsmarine had no carrier experience. The Luftwaffe had no naval aviation tradition. The industrial base had no experience manufacturing carrier-specific equipment. Expecting to develop carrier capability through crash programs and improvised conversions was fantasy. The fact that senior leadership believed this fantasy possible suggests either ignorance of carrier complexity or desperation that overcame rational analysis. The resources wasted on Seydlitz and other carrier projects could have been better allocated. U-boats were Germany's most effective naval weapon. Additional U-boat construction might have extended the Atlantic campaign. Surface ships, while vulnerable to air attack, provided presence and capability that supported operations in Norway and the Baltic. Destroyers and torpedo boats were essential for convoy escort and mine laying. All these platforms could have benefited from resources diverted to carrier conversions. But Hitler and Reiter were fixated on carriers as status symbols as much as operational assets. Carriers represented modernity, technological sophistication, naval power. Germany, as a great power, should have carriers. The fact that Germany lacked the industrial capacity, institutional knowledge, and strategic situation to make carriers effective was subordinated to the desire to possess them. This pattern repeated across German war production. The Tiger tank was superior to Allied tanks individually, but consumed resources that could have produced 3 Panzer IVs. The V-2 rocket program consumed enormous resources while achieving minimal military effect. The focus on wonder weapons and prestige projects diverted resources from proven weapons that could have been produced in greater quantity. Seydlitz represented this syndrome in naval form. Converting her consumed resources for 3 years while producing nothing. Completing her as cruiser would have provided operational ship. Scrapping her and using the steel for U-boats would have provided greater strategic benefit. Instead, she sat incomplete, representing investment that could neither be completed nor recovered. The human cost was minimal compared to combat operations, but still significant. Workers labored for years on a project that was ultimately abandoned. Engineers designed systems that were never implemented. Resources were consumed that could have supported other efforts. The opportunity cost, the value of what was not built because resources went to Seydlitz, is impossible to quantify precisely but was substantial. The strategic lessons were clear but ignored. Complex weapon systems require time, expertise, and industrial capacity. Improvisation and rush programs rarely succeed. Institutional conflicts between services undermine joint projects, and status symbols do not win wars. Germany learned none of these lessons during the war. The pattern of prioritizing prestige over practicality continued until the end. Post-war analysis by Allied naval intelligence documented Germany's carrier programs in detail. The reports concluded that German carrier projects failed due to lack of clear strategic purpose, inadequate industrial capacity, institutional conflicts between services, and leadership fixation on prestige over effectiveness. The conclusion was scathing. Germany wasted resources on carrier programs that had no realistic chance of success while neglecting programs that might have extended the war. The irony is that Graf Zeppelin, if completed, might have been marginally useful. She was purpose-built carrier with coherent design. Her air group, if properly developed, could have provided capabilities the Kriegsmarine lacked. She might have supported commerce raiding or operations in Norway, but completing Graf Zeppelin required resources and focus that Germany diverted to projects like converting Seydlitz, which had no chance of success from the beginning. At 1400 hours on June 5, 1942, Hermann Berkner examined conversion plans that were technically feasible but practically impossible. The conversion could be done in the sense that steel could be cut, structures could be built, systems could be installed. But the conversion could not produce effective carrier because the fundamental requirements, trained pilots, suitable aircraft, institutional support, were absent. Seydlitz would be hull with flight deck, not carrier in any meaningful sense. The project proceeded anyway because Hitler had ordered it, and because the Kriegsmarine was desperate for carriers regardless of whether those carriers could actually operate effectively. The desperation led to 3 years of wasted effort. A ship that was neither cruiser nor carrier, and eventual scuttling to prevent capture. The cruiser that almost became a carrier instead became the cruiser that became nothing. Symbol of Germany's inability to recognize that some problems cannot be solved through willpower and that strategic clarity matters more than symbolic gestures. KMS Seydlitz's legacy is a cautionary tale about the costs of strategic confusion. Building complex weapon systems requires clear purpose, adequate resources, institutional alignment, and realistic timelines. Germany had none of these for carrier programs. The attempt to convert Seydlitz was doomed from conception, but proceeded anyway because admitting failure would have meant admitting that Germany's naval strategy was fundamentally flawed. Better to waste resources on impossible projects than to acknowledge that carriers were beyond Germany's capabilities given its strategic situation, industrial capacity, and institutional dysfunctions. The cruiser that almost became a carrier but instead became monument to wasted effort demonstrates that in war, as in all human endeavors, wanting something badly enough does not make it achievable, and that resources invested in impossible goals are resources not available for possible ones. Seydlitz consumed 9 years of effort and produced nothing except lessons that were learned too late to matter, if they were learned at all.